2010, the Brewers Association reported over 1,760 breweries were making America's beer. It's been 100 years since America had that many breweries. Americans are enjoying the greatest beer renaissance we have ever seen, and nowhere is the brewing comeback more significant than in Wisconsin. Across the state, those who brew craft beer and those who drink it are celebrating a hoppy cornucopia. At the same time, they are keenly aware of Wisconsin's beer heritage, of brewing's important place in Wisconsin history.
Wisconsin was the beer capital of the world. Wisconsin hosted Blatz, Schlitz, Pabst, Miller, Old Style, and Potosi, not to mention the hundreds of breweries that never became giants. For most of the 20th century, Wisconsin brewers brewed more barrels of beer per person than any other brewing region in the world. When it comes to population, Wisconsin is, and always has been, a tiny state, a state where its modest citizenry was once swimming in beer.
So, how did they do it? How did the Wisconsin brewers of the early 20th century come to dominate the brewing industry of the country and the world? And why did they disappear? And what's different now? How will we avoid another beer war of consolidation and cutthroat competition?
It's makeshift, which is all right.
My name's Tanner Brethorst. I'm 33 years old. Grew up in Lodi, Wisconsin, and I'm starting the Port Huron Brewing Company in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. I blame my dad and his buddy Tommy. When I was about 21, they used to go running every Friday afternoon. And after they got done running, they would try out new craft beer from Wisconsin. And every week they would drink a new beer from Wisconsin. And this went on for a while, and it kind of turned into our beer club. And the running kind of went away. And we added more people to the group and had more beers, had like 2 or 3 beers every Friday. Somebody would go out and bring a couple, 3 beers from around Wisconsin. Somebody would bring cheese, and somebody would have a lesson, a study lesson. We had a study group. It was called the Wisconsin Micro and Craft Brew Study Group. So we'd have our beer, have a little snack, and we would do a lesson on beer. So it was, the study part was to make ourselves official and not just a bunch of drunks, I guess. I mean, that's what we did. But that opened my eyes quite a bit. It wasn't just the stuff I was drinking at keg parties while I was in college. This was good beer, and it's tasty. And
Wisconsin was born to be the beer capital of the world. Wisconsin had all the right ingredients: water, cool climate, timber for cooperage or barrels, farm fields for hops, barley, and wheat, and access to big markets like Chicago, and above all else, an immigrant population that not only craved beer, but knew how to brew it. Wisconsin is known for its German roots, but early settlers were Irish, English, Dutch, and Norwegian, all traditional beer makers. It didn't hurt that the first European settlements in Wisconsin were mining boomtowns that happened to have everything in it needed for beer.
I'm standing here on the road into Mineral Point, Wisconsin. This is really where it all began for beer in Wisconsin. Over here on my left, you have the longest running brewery. It started in the 1850s and lasted into the 1960s. There were 3 things that really made this a key place for making beer. You had the cropland, good water source, and you had people to brew it and to drink it. But what on earth would bring people to a place like this, kind of out in the middle of nowhere? Mining, actually. I mean, there's a reason they call this place the Badger State. People came from England and Ireland to just dig underground. With this unglaciated terrain that we have here in Wisconsin in the southern corner, there was a lot of lead. And so we had a boom town. And with a boom town, you're going to have beer. The most important ingredient, good, clean, pure water. And look at this place, it's loaded with springs. I mean, even now in one of the driest summers in my memory, you've got water flowing through here. And that's what you need to make good beer. Pure, well, maybe a little further upstream.
Potosi was just down the road from Mineral Point. As such, it had all the natural advantages to making beer, and it was closer to the Mississippi. It was also a little more German than its Irish and English neighbor, and so was its beer. The Potosi Brewery is one of the first breweries in the state that went on to become a brewing giant. Nowhere on earth, and at any time in history, was there a better incubator of traditional know-how, ingredients, access to raw materials and markets than in early Wisconsin. Wisconsin was indeed destined to become the beer capital of the world. Now don't get the wrong idea. Not to take anything away from the brilliance of people like Joseph Schlitz, Frederick Pabst, Adam Schumacher, or Frederick Miller. The beer barons from Wisconsin engineered the brewing dominance in a time when beer making was competitive, expensive, and risky. By the turn of the 20th century, Wisconsin was synonymous with beer because of these benevolent giants.
But something happened just before 1900, around the time America had those 1,750 breweries. To fully understand the significance of what happened, you have to appreciate how important Milwaukee was to Wisconsin's beer. While breweries like Potosi thrived in other parts of Wisconsin, it was Milwaukee that had cemented itself as Wisconsin's brewing capital. Few will argue that Pabst played a major, if not the largest, role in Milwaukee's reputation. From beer gardens to theaters, Pabst built Milwaukee into a cultural capital. As Milwaukee's status as a cosmopolitan city grew, so did the reputation of his and other Milwaukee, no Wisconsin, beers. But Frederick Pabst needed world affirmation. The 1893 World's Fair provided just the opportunity. Billed as the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair would show visitors how industry and innovation promised to transform the world in magnificent fashion.
At the time, the Big Three, Schlitz, Miller, and Pabst, used the opportunity to claim the Beer King throne against Anheuser-Busch. They wooed drinkers with magnificent displays, beer gardens, and free or cheap beer. There were many awards given for beer and brewing, of which Pabst eked out a slim majority. But among the awards given, Pabst won the coveted Best of Beer. The decision was contentious and controversial at the outset, and remains so to this day. While Pabst and Busch claimed to have won, it was Pabst that forever ordained its premier lager with a blue ribbon. Sure, Pabst wrote his own history and cemented his place and Milwaukee's as a cultural leader, but the beer at the World's Fair came to symbolize much more than a throne. It was a total embrace with industrialization. There was no turning back. Science and technology had an addictive appeal. Mechanization allowed breweries to churn out the same beer using the same ingredients and do so cheaper.
Before the 1890s, beer left the brewery to sit on a rail car, then a stagecoach, then a store shelf that was often hot and well lit. Finally, it would arrive at a tavern or home and usually sit some more. Old beer styles simply could not withstand this abuse and would turn sour and discolored. Science offered solution after solution. Industry made brewing an exact science. Just watch this old Brewers Association video clip.
These brewery laboratories, knowledge passed down through the centuries is combined with modern chemistry of food to produce beverages that would have been the envy of the kings and emperors of old. From the laboratory to the tanks where the finest of American malted grains are fermented, the beer of today is brewed under spotlessly clean conditions. Modern scientific instruments control the entire brewing process. No other food products get more careful attention in manufacture than American beer and ale.
There's a high value in producing scientific beer. That's when things started to go bad for beer. Brewers like Schlitz, Pabst, and Miller were not traveling the world looking for the next best hops or yeast. They thirsted for the latest and greatest mechanical invention. And why wouldn't they? During most of the 20th century, Americans were in love with the factory-made foods of all kinds. From cereals to candy, from canned corn to space-age meat, Americans were in love with uniformity, the packaging, and the affordability of industrial foods.
Traditional recipes and old brewing practices became as out of place as a horse in a NASCAR race.
Why do we call it Port Huron? Oh, well, it's named after our Port Huron steam engine, which was owned by my grandpa. And it stems from basically he got into the hobby because it was his job when he was a kid. He grew up, and when he was 11 or 12, he rode his bike from the farm all the way into town to the guy that had 5 or 6 of these steam engines, and he did contract work for farmers around the area. So Grandpa would fire these things up, get them ready for the day when he was a kid, and then he worked his way up to be an engineer. He always had that love of operating them. And then late 50s, he picked up this steam engine. It's been in our family ever since, and it's something that's been connected with our family for, well, the last 60 years. It's just it's been around, and we've had it in our family, and you can't not talk about our family without getting real close to talking about that machine. So being a family-owned company, I thought it was very fitting. Something and I've also, that's been one of my other passions, is keeping that thing running and having fun with it. It's kind of what we do. So it's a family-owned brewery, family piece of history. Everything we like, we kind of tied it all together.
While early beer production typically kept pace with the population increase in America, after 1900, beer production rose dramatically, even while the number of breweries continued to decline. Only during the decade of Prohibition in the 1920s and 30s did beer production slow. The 20th century represented an era of fewer and fewer breweries making more and more beer.
We came out of Prohibition. We started the age of industrialization. That was when the brewers were all about production. It was about homogenizing the whole process of making beer. So that's when stainless steel kegging came in its own right. Transportation was much different in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. We now did a lot of shipping by truck, not by rail. The process of making beer itself began to be all about how much we could turn out, because if we thought we could turn it out, we could create a market through advertising in a variety of ways to do it. So for the industry, it was about consolidation, streamlining things so that they could maximize how many cans of beer came out of their factories. And what that did is that it began to have the brewing industry rally around really the principal Pilsner style of beer, and the American lager kind of came into its own right. And so that's a type of beer that when you start getting into the industrialized making of it, you just start turning it out. It's like widgets in a way.
Much of that beer was brewed in Wisconsin. But that all came crashing down during the beer wars of the 1960s and 70s. When the beer giants no longer had the smaller brewer to gobble up, they turned to each other. TV commercials became the weapon of choice. The race was on to outmarket your competitor or buy them.
Open a Budweiser and pour yourself the most inviting glass of beer you've ever tasted.
Sure.
Cold, golden Budweiser with that good taste for good times. So go ahead. Live life, every golden minute of it. Enjoy Budweiser. Every golden drop of it.
Budweiser beer is for folks who know where there's life. Where there's life.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Where there's life, there's Bud.
So they defined themselves into a corner almost. And then the vicious circle of can I turn out more and more and more meant that they gobbled up each other. To a point where in the late 1970s we were very much on a decline in terms of numbers of breweries. Our production was actually going up in Wisconsin, the amount of beer that we were making. But the numbers were going down to a point where sooner or later the fittest survive, and that would be Pabst and Miller, G. Heilman. Those were the ones that survived up until the 80s.
In 1960, the United States beer production exceeded 90 million barrels, or about a half barrel per person. Wisconsin produced 12 million barrels, but with a population of just under 4 million people, that's 3 barrels per person. In 1960, Americans on average were consuming 15 gallons of beer per person. Wisconsinites were drinking almost 25 gallons per person. Wisconsin was swimming in beer. But by 1980, it all changed. Wisconsin citizens didn't stop drinking beer, nor did the country as a whole. Everyone was just drinking the same beer. Pumping out mass-marketed, machine-made beer requires a capacity to reinvest regularly on the mechanized infrastructure. This is a tough pill to swallow for the stockholders, driven by cutting costs and high margins. The New York Times was reporting an end of a brewing era in Wisconsin, the former brewing capital of the world.
But at the same time, in the early 1980s, a handful of mavericks were going back to the beginning. Like the brewing pioneers, they wanted quality, drinkable, traditional beer. The closest thing to a traditional beer in the early 80s was a European import. Not surprisingly, but ironically, imported beer sales started taking off. In Wisconsin, that borders on the ridiculous. New names like New Glarus, Sprecher, Capital, and Point pioneered a comeback, a brewing encore. And they did it at a time when Wisconsin brewing was ready to go from a thriving tradition to history and breweriana.
So we filled out our brewer's notice application and sent it in, and we were missing some information. The TTB requested that we had information about all of our investors when it wasn't laid out like that in my eyes on the application. So we finally got it put together and sent off so the government can review our application, but it took a lot of wind out of our sails. Probably partly the blame could be put on me because I didn't dig hard enough, but I guess I trusted the government enough that they would have all the information presented in a fairly easy to read way, and I got a little slowed down by that. It's okay, we're getting past it. We got a little, the momentum went away when we had to go back. So we weren't as excited about some things and weren't pounding on the contractors to get their stuff done. But it's back. Everything's going back on schedule, and we're cranking and getting it put together, and we're going to have a brewery sooner than later.
Randy Sprecher supervised the brewing operations at Pabst and was laid off in 1984.
Well, first of all, to go back even a little further to the West Coast, where I'm from, I was in oceanography school, and I was a home brewer because I had spent time in Germany in the military. I was in Bavaria for 18 months. and I worked for General so I could travel around and try everybody's beers. I was drinking in Belgium in 1968, you know, and believe me, some of those guys have changed, just like a lot of Germans have changed what they make. Well, anyhow, after oceanography, I went to UC Davis, and then from there, I had a variety of job offers, and one was to come out here and brew for Pabst, and so I decided to do that. And you know, at Pabst, I was still home brewing when I was working at Pabst. You know, at Pabst, we were doing 12-hour days, 7 days a week, 84 hours right through summer, no time off. And no one can say anything about that. You lose your job probably. Well, at any rate, after a year and a half, I about had it with them. I lasted a little over 4 years. But we were trying to bring back Ondecker. Then the corporate guys got in charge of everything there to milk the cow, so to speak. And they nixed the Ondecker thing to go to Summerfest. I said, well, it isn't bright enough. I said, it's an opaque cup that's delicious European style beer, and everyone was saying the stuff was double thumbs up, but they nixed the whole thing after all this money we invested, saying it cost too much to filter all malt European style beer. And I said, well, you guys are in for it, because that's what's going to be happening coming down the pipe, you know.
Gartenbrau, originally brewed by Potosi, hit Madison again in the early 1980s. Ed Janis lived in Madison when it no longer had a baseball team or a brewery, both of which had been part of the capital's history since the beginning. He brought back baseball and founded the Madison Muskies, now the Mallards. Then he brought back a brewery. Gartenbrau was Capital Brewery's first success story. Brewed like a German-style import, Gartenbrau became a staple at the Memorial Union, Hyatt hotels, and became a symbol for the microbrewery.
So that was one of the goals, was to just try to make beer that could compete with import beer and be fresher and maybe a little better price point as well. Well, I want to go back to the West Coast, but I had $40,000, and that wouldn't buy a doormat and a front door in California. Here I saw a way to, with sweat equity and my engineering and building skills, got a lot of experience there with building and stuff. I could see a way to start a small brewery with what resources I had. If I was going to work that many hours at Pabst, and I had already been a home brewer for quite a number of years, and worked on some recipes and stuff, but never had the right kind of money, that I might as well, if I was going to work that many hours, I might as well do it for myself, you know. And the whole goal was simply to avoid, you know, looking for a job with someone else. Just kind of pay the bills and keep going and do what you like to do.
Unlike today, making a small brewery from scratch literally meant digging out old parts and patching together the right pieces to make it work. But Wisconsin had an advantage. It is, after all, the dairy state.
Yeah, we got started down there and built the first kettle and a lauter tun and all that kind of stuff from scratch, and figured out different ways to make it cheap. And I was down at the, you know, the metal yard down there, scrap yards all the time, looking for things for cheap or not free. Well, I could see the dairy industry getting ready to collapse in Wisconsin, and they had just tons of gorgeous stainless. And at least on the inside, they had metal jackets and insulation on the outside, and that could be any kind of image there. But so I bought a number of companies and sold off the scrap and then the good stuff to the resale guys and kept what I wanted.
Several small breweries started about the same time. Breweries like Lakefront, the Great Dane, and several that sadly didn't make it. As the 80s grew into the 90s, brewing across the country started to rebound. Companies like Sam Adams in Boston, Bell's in Michigan, and Goose Island in Chicago all began in the 1980s, as beer drinkers everywhere were growing tired of the mass-produced beer. If the 1980s was a prelude to a comeback, the 1990s was the first act.
So starting in the late 90s, you start to have these proliferation of really small breweries. And through the late 90s into the early 2000s, they're making really good beer, and it's really more or less serving local markets. You know, Capital was doing a great job serving the Madison area and the west side of Madison. New Glarus was kind of southern Wisconsin. Lakefront was the Milwaukee area. Central Waters sort of had the middle of the state along with Point. And so, they're really serving local niche areas.
By then, the zeal and appeal of mass-marketed, science and technology-made beer was waning. American nostalgia for handmade, artisan, and lost traditions was countering the robot-made food world. The 1980s also saw the birth of beer competitions like the Great American Beer Festival, which voted Sam Adams Boston Lager the best beer in America in 1985. In 1980, there were 101 breweries in America with an average per-person consumption of 23.8 gallons. By 1990, there were 286 breweries and a per capita about 22 gallons. Growth in brewing, but not beer drinking.
You know, there's really the amount of beer that this country is consuming is actually slightly dipping downward as people become more health conscious, as we ratchet up our distaste for driving under the influence. So the overall beer consumption is going down slightly, but the growth in the craft market is going up. So what people are doing is they might be sort of saying to themselves, well, I'm going to drink less, but I'm going to trade up. I'm going to drink better.
I went out and did like everybody, well, like quite a few people in this business do. They go out and buy a homebrew kit and they start screwing around making beer at home, and that snowballed. For me, that snowballed because I'm a gadget guy. I like to fix and improve and tweak stuff and just make it one step better than it was before. And homebrewing is just a never-ending process.
Kind of the classic model, which is, well, other than it being given to me as a gift. I actually went downtown. It was back when the Wine and Hop Shop here in Madison was on State Street, and always thought, oh, I wonder if you can really make good beer. I wonder what it really tastes like. And finally, just decided, oh, I'm going to give it a try, and bought a kit and did extract brewing for about almost a year. And moved to all grain and moved from a 5-gallon system to a 10-gallon system.
There was nothing in the marketing of beer to suggest beer making was an art, a craft, or even a family tradition. Home brewers, home brewing clubs, and stores fed a small group of brewers who kept alive the traditions, ingredients, and history of age-old brewing styles. Sprecher himself was a well-known homebrewer, and Sam Adams was a homebrewing shop before a brewing company.
The homebrewers, I think you can view them as just very large aficionados and advocates for beer. They fund and put on the Great Taste of the Midwest, so that attracts around 5,000, 6,000. They sell that many tickets, and that's not including the volunteers and the staff that also are all local. We were living with our cousins at the time and he got me into beer brewing. He was doing some extract brews and in the basement with a propane burner, a little on the dangerous side, but you know, you work with you cobble together what you can for starting out. Besides beer, I mean, honey, I'm a mead maker. I actually keep 3 beehives currently here in the city of Madison, and I've been doing that now for the past, this is 5th year, keeping bees, and finally actually get enough honey to make a lot of mead. And so, and that's worked out very well.
What is mead?
Mead is the oldest beverage by majority of accounts, and it is fermented honey. It is one of the beverages that is, because of how expensive honey is and the time it takes as much time to make a mead as it does, say, a red wine, a couple of years generally to have things ferment properly and then age. And so mead is, I think, one of the more, it's the oldest, but it's probably the most underappreciated beverages. There's a lot of good meaderies that are starting up. One in Wisconsin is White Winter. They do good work. Another one is, I forget where they're located, but it's Bee Nectar has just started out. They distribute here in Madison.
Today, the homebrewers' relationship to craft brewing is never more obvious than during the Great Taste of the Midwest Beer Festival. It's hosted by the Homebrewers and Tasters Guild. During the 1990s, brewing in the country exploded. Wisconsin saw even a bigger explosion. But what defines the comeback of the 90s the most is the introduction of craft beer into mass beer markets. Craft beers from Sprecher, New Glarus, Berghoff, and even Leinenkugel shared the beer stage for the first time in 50 years.
In the early 2000s, New Glarus, Spotted Cow in particular, starts blowing up. It starts showing up on every tap handle in the state. You'd be hard-pressed to walk into any bar in this state and not see Spotted Cow on tap. And so what started happening is you had this, these breweries were starting to push out of their own little local niches, and people were starting to say, oh, I'll have that New Glarus beer. And people, I mean, these are people up in Toma and Tony, Wisconsin, drinking a beer from New Glarus. Most of them couldn't find New Glarus on a map, but they're drinking beer from there.
Like their counterparts of 100 years ago, today's craft brewers are not immune to the effects of new technologies. The 90s also introduced the consumer to the wide world of the internet. The World Wide Web permanently changed the consumer, from Amazon to .coms worldwide. The internet was and remains the place Americans turn to when thinking of where to spend their money. Unlike books on Amazon, beer can't be sent via UPS. If it could have, imagine what the growth would have been like. The internet offers information about choices.
Remember the second beer you had, the Hamburg Ed, the same brewery.
When it comes to buying beer blogs, rating video shows, and professional online reviews, in theory, create a wiser beer buyer. At least that seems to be the hope. In Wisconsin, new books from authors Jerry Apps, Robin Shepard, and Kevin Revelinsky reminded us all of Wisconsin's deep appreciation for Wisconsin beer.
What we have here in Mineral Point, actually, is the oldest train.
In fact, some would argue that books like these helped fuel the comeback, along with beer tours, festivals, special brands, and brewing clubs.
So, are you nervous?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, now that you've asked, my stomach is kind of clenching up a little more. It's becoming more apparent. But yeah, I'm nervous because anything and everything might go wrong. But I'm hoping not. I've done the math. I've done the homework. I've understood the process. And I think it's going to go okay. But there's a lot of things that could happen when we mash in. Is our pH going to be right? Did I get it right so where the enzymes are going to react and give me the right kind of sugars that I want? Is my boil going to go okay? We had a steam valve go out yesterday, and we're going to have to make it go manually and hopefully hit our temperatures correctly. So if we don't hit the right temps, we're going to have a beer that's not going to taste like I want it to taste. Is our heat exchanger going to leak or not? Is our chiller going to keep the fermenter cold at the end of the day so it can ferment at the right temperature and give us the right flavor?
As far as where craft beers are going, I don't think anybody's really sure. It's really getting a lot bigger nationwide, and we really made a dent in the import thing. You can see how they're struggling to try to make more different brands and stuff. Something like Newcastle is the largest import draft in the United States. Now Newcastle has seasonals offering anything, and the big breweries are trying to look like craft breweries, and try to get in this trade. So it's a big part of this is generational, and as the generations come and go, they have a different idea about what beer they want to drink and the image it should have.
The beer and brewing community is growing. Now, in 2011, a generation of beer drinkers, born in the 80s or 1990, are now joining the beer renaissance. They grew up around a beer cornucopia and are promising to take the beer comeback the next step. The last 10 years has seen unbelievable growth in the numbers of craft breweries in the U.S. and Wisconsin. Even during a major economic downturn, the craft brewing industry is maintaining its growth. As of 2010, almost 1,800 breweries dot the country, nearly all craft breweries. But not all of them are new breweries. Some, like Point, have been brewing since the 1850s, but with new ownership, has focused itself as a craft brewery. The same is true for the Minhouse Brewery, the former Joseph Huber Brewery in Monroe, and Gray's Brewing in Janesville.
But one Wisconsin brewer, one which was once the 5th largest in the state and the national contender, has come back from the ashes and is being reclaimed by its community. Part historical restoration, part craft brewery, Potosi has joined the Wisconsin brewing tradition as a craft brewery and non-profit charity.
Brief history of my background in Potosi goes back quite a ways. I was born and raised here, and my parents are 84 years old and they still live and work here, so it goes back quite a ways. But I took off for a number of years to get an education and pursue my profession as an artist, and yearned for the Midwest. Always loved this part of the country, and came back and discovered that the brewery, which everyone had loved while I was growing up and I assumed would have some benefactors taking care of it, was under-maintained and falling apart, and it broke my heart that it was in that condition. That was back in 1989. My cousin and my best friend and I decided to buy the brewery in 1997, and it became obvious that this was going to become a community activity, and turned it into a nonprofit foundation, made it eligible for a variety of other federal and state grants. One thing led to another, things were falling into place. Once those first amounts of seed money started taking hold, then the community realized that this really could happen, and we started realizing some private monies coming in, and it just snowballed.
There were a lot of people who lived in Potosi, but they had jobs at Fenimore, Platteville, Lancaster, Dubuque. When a lot of those jobs dried up in the 70s and the 80s, we did not want this to become a dying community. We wanted to keep it a viable community. Well, here sat the Potosi Brewery. It was a derelict of a building, but there was a group, myself and several others, who believed that something could be done. And we worked and raised money, and 8 years later, here's the restored brewery. And there is a resurgence in microbreweries. You know, there's nothing wrong with the products put out by the large corporate breweries, but it is a cookie cutter product. No matter where you go in the country, you can get the same thing. You'll notice many of the big breweries are also trying to experiment with novelty beers. The microbreweries don't have to experiment with novelty beers because they have a variety of beers that they're producing for a clientele that they want that product. There's a niche market for the microbreweries, and we're being part of that niche.
Though they look nothing like they did in the 1970s, they arguably are recreating the efforts of Potosi's original beginnings. A dedication to community, to great beers, and small scale is how every brewery begins in Wisconsin. That has never changed.
My name is Don Zamzol. I'm a partner with my son, who is the brewer of the Bull Falls Brewery. I take care of promotions and some of the financial stuff. We started in our brewery in December of 2007, and we're now going to be 4 years old this December.
How are things going?
Things are going very well. We are selling everything that we can brew, and people are waiting for more. So we're planning on an expansion this fall, and hopefully be able to begin packaging sometime next spring.
What do you attribute to your success?
I think the single most important item is the beer itself, because that's what it's all about. We are sticking to ethnic type beers from Europe. We have German lagers and English ales, and we are in northern Wisconsin, and there's a lot of ethnic communities up there, and it appeals to them, and I think that's the major draw on it.
In some ways, it sounds like craft breweries can't fail. but they do. Like any small business, there's a risk and an emotional investment. But some things are very different for the new Wisconsin brewer. First, they share a collective memory of a painful historical collapse. They know how a dog-eat-dog mentality is done in the diversity of brewers. Today there seems to be a brotherhood or allegiance among craft brewers. They want their fellow brewer to do well. There is even perhaps a naive embrace of competition.
It would still help this facility. I'm not really afraid of competition because I look at the number of wineries that are in the state and in the region. People take winery tours. They don't just go to one winery. They stop and visit maybe several wineries. So if there's another brewery here, people will still stop in this facility. So I think competition is a plus, not a negative.
Sure. Okay. Another production brewery comes into the Dells. Awesome. That's great. For a few reasons. It's going to make people's interest grow for coming up to check out breweries in the Dells or get a hold of Dells beer now, because people are taking a road trip. We're going to go take a brewery tour. People don't usually stop in a town where there's one brewery and then, have to get on the road and go somewhere else. If they come to a town that, well, now there's 2 breweries in town. That's great. There's reason enough to stop. If there's 3 breweries, heck yeah. Now we're making a day out of it. That we have to go to the Dells, we check into our hotel, and we're going to just hop between breweries. That's great.
It's the other thing I think that you see in this industry today. The craft brewers really do rally around their own niche. Wisconsin is fascinating to watch because of the 70 breweries there. Those that I explained earlier that are making less than 2,500 barrels a year, they really do see themselves almost as an economic cluster in a way. They'll help each other. They'll talk about how to share things. In the Madison area, if somebody needs a little extra yeast or they're short on hops, they can pick up the phone and they can call somebody on the other side of town, and that brewer will help them. Now when the day is over, sure, are they competing for perhaps a finite amount of beer that can be sold in Madison? Perhaps, but the camaraderie is pretty special for where the industry is at today. Different than what we saw with the big breweries coming out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
But ultimately, they know the risk. They are betting their livelihoods and that of others on their beer success.
Yeah, I feel like it. I feel like I'd be letting everybody down. I do. I lay awake at night already before we made a drop of beer, thinking about, I got all these people betting on me, and they put in their money to make this thing go, and I've got to do absolutely everything in my power to make good for them. They believed in me, and I want to come through for them. We'll worry about, what happens if it doesn't make it. Sure. I don't know what I'll do. This is it. I've been the last 10 years. This has been on my mind. I've wanted to start a brewery.
So, what did we learn? Brewing beer in a time of celebrated growth isn't all kumbaya. It's an art, a tradition, and even a craft, but it's also a business. As craft brewing grows, it will need to take up a larger and larger chunk of the mass beer market. Nothing suggests Americans are going to start drinking more beer. So while the brotherhood of today's brewers is strong, they are realistically competing for a relatively small share of the beer market.
There probably are, market niches that say this is a 200,000 barrel market, and what share are we out of that? If you know what that number is, then perhaps that changes the dynamics of competition between each other. But when you haven't figured out that number, because the market still continues to grow and take whatever beer that's going in there, Well, that's a little different. The competition isn't quite as fierce.
Craft beers that appeal to lager drinkers promise to convert more consumers to microbrewed beer. But does that mean it's just a matter of time before we see national TV commercials from Wisconsin craft brewers? While making this film, on the first day of our interview with Tanner, Goose Island Brewery in Chicago was sold to Anheuser-Busch, the makers of Budweiser. This was eerie, considering we had asked Tanner if he was successful and ever offered a chunk of change by Miller, would he sell?
It's a tough decision. It really is. Personally, I think there's always two ways to look at it. I've worked in breweries, and it's tough. It's a tough go. You'll wake up every day and go slog through the brewery in your boots, and work in that hot environment and that wet environment. It's nasty, hard work, and you're there every day doing it. So if somebody comes and offers you a big fat check, well, you're pretty tempted to say, "Here's the keys. Have fun." Is it too tough, or is it something we want to continue? I don't know. Personally, I think, from my standpoint, I think I'd like to keep it going.
The question now is, what is Anheuser-Busch going to do with Goose Island? Are they going to, crush it and just keep it down and cause them to fold their plants and make their beer, commodity beer? Or are they going to embrace the image that Goose Island has built for itself, let them run their own brewery, let them run their own brands, and let them continue to develop their own reputation and their own beers in their own unique ways? And meanwhile, the money just goes to Anheuser-Busch at the end of the day, instead of into the pockets of a Chicago-based brewer.
The two most promising lessons regarding craft beer in Wisconsin has very little to do with the individual brewer, but the state itself. As long as the world drinks beer, Wisconsin will be a major beer state. With the best natural advantages, water, and farmland, beer is not just a fermented malt beverage. It is and always has been tied to strong agriculture.
Historically, the Wisconsin Dells area and the rest of Wisconsin was a very intensive hop growing area in the 1860s and 1870s. But that didn't last very long. It was sort of a boom and bust thing. And there's no reason we can't bring it back, because now we have better knowledge of the fertility needs of the hops, and we have better knowledge of chemical control for fungus and insects whenever that may be needed. And we've got more varieties, which are just more resistant to some of the diseases that we have here in the humid upper Midwest.
Beyond the natural advantages, Wisconsin is swelling with beer makers and drinkers who are proud to honor the state's traditions, eager to remain true to local markets and support sustainable commerce.
I think New Glarus is a great example. And I heard a statistic that says of all of the states in the nation, if you were to take them and poll the people in those states and ask them, are you proud of the businesses in your state, and do you support the businesses in your state solely because they come from your state? So we'll call this state brand identity. The strongest in the nation, unsurprisingly, is Texas. People are from Texas, they're proud to be from Texas, and they buy things from other people who are from Texas. Number 2 is Wisconsin. That to me says a lot about the people in this state.
There is something to be said for being able to say brewed in Wisconsin. And around the world, from the judge's table to the beer shelf, the tavern and the festival, there is always a giddy anticipation when a beer fan reaches for a Wisconsin brewed beer.
Somewhere in the world, it's happy hour. Somewhere, a bartender is asking, what'll it be? And somewhere, someone is responding, I'll have something from Wisconsin.
Local, can't really get any more local than that. But yeah, get ready for hops. This one will kick you. This is really good.
Yummy.
we conducted our own investigation and found significant differences between ratings of some popular Wisconsin craft beers. So what is a buyer or brewer to do? Are these helpful for brewers and beer drinkers? Well, to assist and to quench our own curiosity, we conducted a test to rate the ratings with a blind beer tasting. We brought back some of the cast of the film to see how reliable the ratings of online judges are for even the most enthusiastic beer drinker. Our tasters showed agreement regarding which beers were considered better than others. They also showed consistency between tests. When the same beer tester blindly tasted the same beer a second time, the ratings were similar each time. Okay, so which beers did we judge? We tested 9 Wisconsin beer lagers, 4 Wisconsin wheat ales, and 5 Wisconsin porters. We used a generic 10-point scale, with 10 being the highest rating possible. Among the lagers of our blind taste test, Miller High Life scored the lowest ranking, while Sprecker's Black Bavarian received our highest applause in both tests. The New Glarus 2 Women Lager was a close second. For the wheat beers, the overall ratings were lower than for lagers or porters, and there was less significant separation in ratings. That said, the 2 wheat beers, Berghoff Solus Wheat and Point's Horizon Wheat, bested Capital or Leinie's wheat counterparts. The porters received the most enthusiastic applause. The judges gave Wisconsin porters the highest ratings overall, and even the poorest showing received an average higher rating than the best wheat beer. Oso's Night Train received the highest porter rating and the best overall average of the 14 beers we tested. But that was just ahead of Tyranina's Chief Blackhawk and Central Water's Mud Puppy Porter. Tell me what you think about the beer, right?
Yeah. It's definitely an American porter. It has, as opposed to an English porter, it is higher body, definitely high on the roasted notes. Fair amount of hopping to it. If I were to guess, I would say Great Lakes Edmund Fitz, possibly Bell's Porter, or possibly Oso Night Train, if it's a Wisconsin. It's definitely higher bodied, seems pretty good. I would probably give it a 7 or an 8.
So how did our ratings stack up against the online community? We compared our ratings against those of Rate Beer and Beer Advocate, 2 popular beer rating websites used around the globe. Our results showed a strong consistency between the online sites and our testers, with only a few anomalies. First, Oso's Night Train received our highest rating among all beers tested, while Rate Beer and Beer Advocate both ranked Sprecker's Black Bavarian as the best beer. The Black Bavarian was our runner-up for best overall beer. But online judges also give the Night Train extremely high marks. Overall, our tasters preferred porters over lagers and lagers over wheat beers. This preference pattern also holds up online. But there are some noticeable differences among the wheat beers. Neither Capital's Island Wheat nor Leinie's Sunset Wheat were given high marks by our testers. We seem to prefer Point's Horizon Wheat. The online judges seem to prefer Capital's and Leinie's. Online judges and our blind judges, with the exception of one, give Miller High Life poor marks. So what's the lesson? Well, there might be some validity to the ratings online if your palate is one that prefers craft beers. But remember, our judges were blind tasters. They did not have an opportunity to influence results based on brand loyalty. This is good news for new brewers who might be intimidated by being a new kid on the block. It looks like, at least for now, beer fans around the world are willing to give all beer a fair shake.